There are some actual literal historical floods. We know about the way that floods can affect a particular population of individuals, or any type of organism. And for some of you that might be interested in learning a little bit more about this, there's the Toba catastrophe theory. You may have a glimmer of recollection of this. It was a point in sort of pre-Homo sapien history, about 77,000 years ago. There was a massive supervolcano eruption that led to a 7 to 10 year, not nuclear winter, volcanic winter. And during that time, it appears that there was a bottlenecking event in human evolution, that we went to a much smaller effective population size. And the same thing happened, and I think this is really the most interesting part, the same thing happened to our parasites. Things like the human head louse, which does not have the ability to then jump to being a zoonotic parasite. You see the same bottlenecking event occur in our parasites, and that would have been very effective evidence on a global scale to see a sudden restriction of genetic diversity in not only the humans, but essentially in all animals. And they all dated their markers back to that same point, where they all went through a bottlenecking event. 7 individuals is obviously a very small number of animals. We should be seeing that kind of information.
And exactly, I mean, that's the crux of it. It's what would it take for me to believe in the flood? Well, I asked the question, what would the universe look like if there was a global flood? What would it look like if there wasn't? I would expect to see this genetic bottlenecking in every species, in the parasites going with it. I would expect to see that take place in the strata as well. Geologically, we would see features that are indicative of a flood. I mean, I would expect not to see 6,000-year-old trees. So many things like that. I mean, I would expect to see every fish alive now able to live in fresh or salt water, be able to go back and forth. But the fact of the matter is, their kidneys simply aren't made for that. I mean, they can't do it. Most can't, at least. And it's just the fact that, the prediction of what would we expect to see, it's completely, the opposite of what we do see, which is why no thinking person who understands the evidence can take it as literal.
And I should mention that the Genesis account was often used, the story of Noah was often used in support of slavery. And it's the events that happened once Noah got drunk and was working it in his tent. And one of his sons told the other two to cover him. I don't know if the implication was that, he was laughing about it, but the other two walked in backwards holding a robe and covered his nakedness. And Noah cursed his son, which one is it?
Ham.
Crap. Ham. Cursed Ham to be a servant to the other two. And from that, the Hamitic people included I believe the African population. No?
No. I think that comes from those guys in Utah. That doctrine. I don't know about that people.
Well, actually, I'm going to be talking. Yeah, I'm going to be talking about this in a little less than a week in Darwin Day. My presentation actually deals with this, the origin of black people and multiple races and how they make excuses for these. There are people out there who believe, still today, there are people who believe that the black community are not related to white people. There are people who believe that. There are people who believe that dark skin is not a product of natural adaptation to an environment in the tropics, but that it is a curse visited upon them by a god.
It's the mark of Cain.
In one story, in one interpretation, it's the mark of Cain. In another, it is the sons of Ham, being cursed to be servants, because there were people who documented that who presented the idea that there was such a thing as a natural slave, that there were people who were born to be slaves, and in the United States history there were people that were arguing that this was actual science. And of course they're doing it for religious reasons, but there were people who were making this argument.
And I have a lot of experience with Mormons, especially. I mean, something that a lot of people don't know, and I didn't know, at least until I got in, was in dental school. Utah doesn't have a dental school, so they ship their Mormons out to just about every other dental school in the country. So we've got, you'll have a couple in every class, which is, I've never really been exposed to Mormons, but they believe their stuff. They believe some really weird shit. But then again, it's really, I say that it's weird because, but being raised a Christian, we all look at, mass delusion that is Christianity and that it's perfectly acceptable or that it makes sense, that a magic rib woman listened to a talking snake and ate a magical piece of fruit, therefore we all have to die. And, the best way to cure that is to have a self-sacrifice in Bronze Age Palestine. But, that sounds strange, but the only reason that we say that nobody really thinks that's strange is because everybody's accustomed to it. That's normal. There are so many people believing it. If I were to go to a shrink and say similar things, these crazy things that I believed, I would be declared insane. But it's just the fact that so many people believe that it's acceptable. So actually what the Mormons believe isn't really that much stranger than everything else. But go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to Andy in a second, but I just want to agree with what you've just said, Johnny. It's because people are taught this that it is acceptable that children's games are created. In fact, I did a search before the program started. Noah's Ark children's games, 612,000 hits. And it's taught as if this is a morally wonderful story. And the children are invited to play with the little 2x2 animals and draw rainbows and stuff like that. What they don't seem to be getting or being taught or understanding is the fact it was global genocide. But there we are. Andy, did you want to comment?
I don't want to say, to be perfectly honest. I'd just like to say too, I think Aaron commented on obviously we're talking about the flood at the moment, but whereabouts did the first account of the flood come? If it wasn't in the Bible, first of all, whichever sort of holy book was it? Did the Bible? Do you think it kind of stole it from another book and then just kind of regurgitated it?
There are three. You look up the Epic of Atrahasis, and also look up the name Zuisudra and Utnapishtim. Primarily, what you get is out of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and this was originally discovered in the 1920s in an archaeological find that was Ashurbanipal's library, and it dates back, if I remember correctly, a heck of a long time before even the Book of Job. The earliest Sumerian renditions, they told the same story, and so you would end up with Utnapishtim, I think it was in this case, who was recounting the story to Gilgamesh himself, because Gilgamesh's culture was not subject to that flood. He didn't know. And so Utnapishtim is telling them about the flood that went on in their land, and it was 22 cubits of depth. And that covered all the land for as far as you can see, because it's a floodplain. Of course it will. 22 feet of depth in a rock will cover everything, and you won't be able to see mountains on the horizon at all. And there were all these people, there were all these bodies, and as the waters recede, there are channelways that were stopped up with floating bodies. And this is the way the story is recounted. And it's grisly and horrifying. And importantly, what brought the flood on was the polytheistic religion of the time. They had multiple gods, and they got tired of men because men made so much noise, especially at night, it seems. And so they decided to bring on this flood to kill them all because they're too loud and too obnoxious. These are, because these are human gods. These are gods of human construct. They are basically human beings with magical powers. And they bring on a flood, and the flood turned on to be worse than they could control. It was beyond the control of the gods in the amount of havoc that it brought about. And so this is why you have this thing about apologizing for ever having brought the flood in the first place.
Okay.
Now, I have one point real quick. Was Noah the only person in the world with a fucking boat? I just mean...
That's true. I had never thought of it.
Realistically, there had to be more than one boat at that time. Like, if the flood was coming and the ark could survive it with its big length, oh shit. Flood.
Well, that's
where I'm going in my boat.
It's an important point that you just brought up. We have to remember that archaeologically, at the time that the flood was supposed to have happened, there were already Native Americans that, what we would call the Indians were still here, or were already here. We had many different cultures around the world that were already, the same cultures that are there now, were already there. And many of them had boats 10,000 years ago and further back. There were boats all over the world, and the same cultures are still there, were there before the flood, are still there after the flood, and had shipping yards during this whole event. And yet, although their cultures precede anything that the white man can claim by a heck of a long way, and they have archaeological, and they have artifacts, and they even, in some cases, have written histories and such, they don't recognize that this global flood ever happened, nor could it have. We know that it's an absolute impossibility from every possible perspective, which is what makes it so bewildering that anybody still clings to this. I'm sure that people that promote creationism wish desperately that that flood was not part of their story, because it doesn't make sense on any level, and it is very often the very first thing that people look at when they decide, when they start to lose their faith, and they say, you know what? There's just no way in hell that could actually happen.